Biblical prophecy is really never impressive, but the religious like to trot it out now and then, so sometimes it's fun to watch them make a fool of themselves. Today, we're going to dive into the book of Daniel and find out why it doesn't mean what the religious desperately need it to mean. But, what else is new, right? So here goes nothing, which is exactly what the religious actually have. Hope you enjoy. Today, we're visiting a channel called Know the Word, Live the Word. And if there's one thing that becomes painfully clear right up front, it's that these people don't actually know anything. Anything at all. They make every mistake it's possible to make just because of their flawed approach to epistemology. Because they're not interested in the truth. They've got a goal in mind, and they're going to reach it no matter how false it actually is. Sound familiar? I really wish these people could get anywhere close to factual reality. I'm sure that's just too much to ask for, though, so let's go watch another example.
Welcome to Know the Word, Live the Word. This is Chris Bender. If you're an atheist and you've read the book of Daniel, you are going to encounter some serious problems.
Well, I've read it, and I never encountered a one. Now, I figure I know what he's going to say, and keep in mind, I haven't even seen the video yet, so I can only guess, like you must. But there's a lot of typical things that Christians claim about Daniel, and those things never go well for the religious. Never. Because there are things that either they don't know about Daniel, or that they will just lie to your face about Daniel, and it's just not what they seem to think that it is. Anyway, let's get to it. Tell us what's going to blow us completely out of the water. This ought to be good.
Daniel is very specific around a number of prophecies that he couldn't possibly have known living centuries before these predicted things occurred.
Yeah, about that. Now, I'll let him get into the specifics before I blow them all away, but the actual dating of Daniel is not what they wish it was. Because if you look at what the overwhelming majority of Old Testament scholars say, it just doesn't match up with what these apologists need it to say in order for their claims to be remotely true. But of course, that's the rub right there, isn't it? Because the apologists don't care about the scholarship. They interpret the Bible the way that makes their apologetics seem most convincing, not in the way the evidence actually shows the Bible must be. Because, who cares about the evidence, right? Certainly not the apologists.
So as an atheist, what's your best approach? Even though you don't have proof, your best approach is to indicate that Daniel was written in the 2nd century BC, speaking of someone living late in the 6th century BC.
Because that's what the evidence shows, and that's what virtually all Bible scholars, both secular and religious, say. This is really absurdly silly when you think about it. It's like saying that because Shakespeare wrote Antony and Cleopatra, well, that means he must have been writing prior to 30 BCE, because that's when Cleopatra died. It's utterly absurd to make that claim, given that all of the evidence we have shows that Shakespeare actually wrote the play around 1600 CE. How could there be a 1600-year discrepancy in the dating? Well, there isn't. There's just a fallacious interpretation by those who desperately need one claim to be true.
You have to at least date it that early, since the manuscripts predate Jesus' generation. Guess what? That's exactly what they've done to try to discredit the prophecies of Daniel. There's still one massive problem.
And we'll handle that when it comes. But let's get back to the reason why Daniel is, in fact, a 2nd century book and not the 6th century book that the apologists require. First off, the author of Daniel never says when it was being written. It gives some indications in the text which have been interpreted that way, such as talking about the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, and portrays Daniel as a Jewish refugee in Babylon. But anyone can claim anything they want to claim. It's where the proof lies that's the problem. Daniel claims that Belshazzar was king of Babylon during the time that he was writing. Yet the fact remains that Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus and that he ruled for 8 years while his father went out to live in the desert. Belshazzar was never actually king of Babylon. He never appears in the official rolls, and anyone who had actually lived there during the supposed reign would have known that. The writer of Daniel simply got it wrong. Likewise, Daniel places the reign of Cyrus after that of Darius, which is simply false. It is inexcusable for anyone who was living at the time to make that error. It's like claiming that Obama was president after Trump. It didn't happen that way. He also entirely neglected to mention the Edict of Cyrus, which allowed the Hebrews to go back and live in Israel, something that no contemporary Hebrew living in that day would have ever failed to mention. Hundreds of years later, it really wasn't that big a deal, but in the moment, not a chance. Then Daniel presents the Babylonians as actively persecuting the Hebrews, which is factually incorrect. The Hebrews living in Babylon had a largely peaceful existence where they were treated mostly as equals. A lot of modern Jewish conventions began at that time, such as the canonization of the Torah and the entire synagogue system. It is inconsistent with what we actually know about the history. Next, the so-called prophecies of Daniel actually put a nail in the coffin of the religious claims. He's pretty accurate right up until you get to the 2nd century when the book was actually being written, after which he got pretty much everything wrong. The apologists like to gloss over that fact, but there's a really clear line between when Daniel was mostly correct and when he goes completely off the rails into Fantasyland. It allows modern scholars to place the writing of Daniel pretty accurately at 164 BCE. The earliest fragment from Daniel that we have comes from 100 BCE, and the first complete book that we have, unbelievably, comes from the 10th century CE. Clearly, there are fragments that predate it, but the Masoretic text, which is the first complete copy that we have, that is where we get most of the ideas that we have about Daniel. There is other evidence, of course, but this is enough to completely debunk the idea that Daniel was written in the 6th century BCE. It just didn't happen, and these people are completely wrong.
The prophesied 70 weeks of Daniel. These weeks, or collection of 7 years, point to the ultimate fulfillment for Israel. Even if you assume Daniel was written under the pretense of living in the 6th century BC, he predicts the coming of the Messiah to occur 483 years after the proclamation to rebuild the temple.
So what? Because, as with most apologists, he's just assuming that what it says in the Bible is true because he desperately needs it to be true. And that's nothing all that new. This is something that has been done throughout history. This is something that lots of religions, especially Christianity, has done for a very, very, very long time. All it means is that someone picked up on that prophecy, and when Jesus came along, because you have to remember that the Hebrews were looking for a Messiah, it's not something that just came out of the blue. Jesus was just a likely candidate, and he got picked as one that people would go with. It doesn't mean that Jesus was the Messiah. It doesn't mean that there would ever be a Messiah. You have to remember, the Jews are still waiting for one to show up. But when you have a bunch of people looking to fulfill a supposed prophecy from the past, making it happen isn't at all uncommon. A couple of convenient stories by people who were demonstrably not eyewitnesses later, and hey, you've got yourself a cult.
This points to none other than Jesus' generation. The Jews of the first century were not blind to this. They could do math just like we can. This is why so many false messiahs came forward.
Yet, he can't recognize that Jesus was just as likely to be a false messiah as any of the rest of them. Here we had a bunch of people trying to be the Messiah to varying degrees of success. And just because Jesus made it big, eventually, once the Emperor of Rome made it the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that had nothing at all to do with Jesus, but nope, because Jesus was their favored Messiah, suddenly they can just ignore the rest of the contenders and play make-believe that it was really Jesus all along. And this is the problem with starting with a conclusion and then working backwards, as the religious all tend to do. You don't actually have to provide significant evidence for your conclusion. You just assume that it's true, and then you cherry pick the data until you can convince yourself that you were right all along. And that's all this guy is doing, which is pretty sad.
Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, speaks of false messiahs such as Theudas, who secured hundreds of followers around AD 46. He speaks of others claiming to be the Messiah, such as an Egyptian who gained 30,000 followers, but Felix and his soldiers stomped out that rebellion around AD 55. He speaks of another impostor who promised the people deliverance and freedom, yet he and his followers were destroyed by Festus around AD 60. The Bible also confirms false messiahs with Gamaliel's speech in Acts 5, and it's another witness concerning Theudas, and also a Judas of Galilee who rose up with many behind him and was also destroyed.
So, we all agree that there were lots of people at the time trying to fulfill the prophecy. Now, prove with evidence that any of them actually did, because you can't. Now, I'm sure that at the time that these various Messiah candidates were running around, their followers were all every bit as convinced that their particular pet Messiah was the right one, just like this guy thinks that his was, but none of them can actually prove it. It's why faith doesn't actually get you anywhere. Anyone can have faith in anything, true or false. Come on back when you actually have evidence. We'll wait. A very, 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 very long time, more than likely.
So the question remains, was there a real Messiah in the first century AD? Daniel writes, 70 weeks are determined for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins. Despite this verse, the first century Jews were looking for someone to end Roman oppression, not sin.
Which just goes to show that no matter what prophecies say, the actual people will reinterpret things to fit their current situation. It's what happens to this very day when they just go back into their holy books and reinterpret the words to mean whatever is most convenient for them to mean. Yet none of them can actually demonstrate that any of it means a damn thing. Claims don't mean anything. Only evidence does, and the religious are really, really bad at evidence, aren't they? It's why prophecies need to be extremely strong and not open to interpretation. Otherwise, as with what happens in this, you get people just making shit up because it makes them happy. And if you notice, that's the exact same thing that happens with Nostradamus, where the prophecies only come to pass in retrospect. They can't say, well, on such and such a day, in such and such a place, this event will take place. No, they have to go back and say, well, we interpreted this thing that happened before as fulfilling this prophecy. And that's not impressive to anyone. Because here's the thing. for most Christians to make their prophecies work, they have to interpret Daniel 9:26 through 27 as referring to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. Except that falls 37 years after the end of the 70 weeks. Oh well, according to Christians, we'll just fudge the numbers a little bit and just not talk about it. Why? Because that's pretty much how their theology works. Spin the narrative so it comes out where they want it to, and when they can't do that, well, a couple of white lies don't hurt, do they? But it gets even more ridiculous because there is a second interpretation made by dispensationalist Christians where they interpret all of the verses differently and then they just make up arbitrary dating methods to make it all work. According to them, the 70 weeks starts in 444 BCE when the emperor first authorized the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem instead of 458 BCE as most Christians do. This is a problem because it places the end of the 70 weeks somewhere between 40 and 47 CE, which is far too late for Jesus to qualify. How do they handle it? Well, they simply invented a special biblical year of 360 days yanked straight out of their asses so the math would work out right. And this kind of thing happens all the time. They start with the conclusion and the facts just don't matter. And I'm not sure why this is a surprise at all.
So is Jesus the promised Messiah? Atheists consider this. Daniel also prophesied that during the time of Rome's power, a kingdom would start, not by human hands, that would spread across the entire earth. This was the kingdom of God that Jesus spoke so much about. Sorry, atheists, you cannot deny that Christians fill every continent and have outlasted the kingdoms of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome.
Yeah, except Daniel also prophesied that following the Fourth Empire, Rome in this case, Jesus would come again. Yeah, about that. Where is he, Christians? Oh right, they just don't talk about that part because it's inconvenient to their narrative. Jesus is supposed to come back after Rome falls, and here we are, more than 1,500 years later, still waiting. I've actually heard Christians claim that the Bible doesn't actually specify how long after Rome fell that this was supposed to happen, which is just ridiculous. It's just a case of desperately trying to get the facts to fit their emotionally held conclusion, often by just lying about the facts and cherry-picking the data. Because they really don't care, do they? After that, he just preaches for a little bit and we really don't need to hear that because we've already shown that he hasn't got a clue. And that's really the case with almost all apologists if you notice. In order to get anywhere close to their conclusions, they require that everyone has blind faith in the veracity of the Bible, and if you don't, as atheists don't, the whole thing comes tumbling down. This is exactly why you don't start with a conclusion and then desperately try to reach it. It only makes you look like an idiot. And that's what these people are. They're idiots. You have to start with the facts, examined independently, and see where those facts happen to lead. It's why the religious fare so poorly when they deign to talk to atheists, because they will come up with one thing that, if you squint just right, seems to get them in the right ballpark, and then when the non-religious point out that it really doesn't help them, they can't modify their position any. They've got one and only one goal in mind, and when they think that goal can't be wrong, well, what else can they do? It's too bad that their beliefs are wrong so often. Well, too bad for them. For us, it's just another Monday. Watching the religious fail miserably, that's what we do. Because, what the hell else is new, right?
Bum